So the first thing that I actually wanted to show you all is response to Tarek's. The organisation I work for has created this lovely dev's guide to user testing and doing lots of things to do with users. So please go take a look. I will drop the link in the Discord. It was funded by Internews, and they are doing a lot of really great things about making tool teams for open source have access to resources. So you can find things like scripts for how to conduct user tests and lots of other ways of recruiting users and all those kinds of lovely things. The other thing is that, it's also on a repo, so if you want to suggest new things, you can go in here and add an issue, if you know what that is. Read the manual if you don't. But you can ask for things that aren't there and what you want to see. So talk to us and tell us what you want from designers to help you out. And the other thing is, if you don't know where designers are and you want to ask them for help, opensourcedesign.net, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, we have a jobs board, but it's not just paid stuff, but it's gratis stuff. So if you want to ask a designer to help contribute, this is one of the best places to go. And then come and join us on our lovely discourse forum where we talk about stuff. Right, okay, for the talk. So that was like a little preamble. So it's quite late, so I'm going to try and be as quick as I can. So this is going to go into a specific project that I worked on when I was at Ushahidi, and I'll talk a little bit about Ushahidi as an open source organization, but this is about the design contributions to open source software and the learnings that we had from the Open Design project. But this is me. I've been doing stuff for 12 years in design and user experience. I've been doing stuff in the humanitarian and third sector and human rights sector about 9 years. I've been doing stuff in open source software, or FLOSS, or however you want to call the acronym, for about 5 years, and I'm also doing a PhD about it. That's cool, interesting, in computer science, up in Newcastle, researching how designers get involved with open source, and specifically humanitarian and human rights related open source. I call myself a human rights centered designer, which is another talk for another time. I currently work at an organisation called Simply Secure. We mostly work on tools to do with open technology, human rights, security and privacy, high-risk people doing stuff with technology around the world, maybe in places where they're not supposed to do those kinds of things with technology, like talking about oppressive governments or other things like that. So we work on a lot of those kinds of tools and a lot of with a lot of non-profits. But this talk and the content from it is from when I worked at Ushahidi. Some of you might be familiar with Ushahidi, maybe not, but I'll talk about their open source tools. So Ushahidi is a Kenyan tech NGO that make open source tools. The first one that they made, the example on the left-hand side of the screen, is the open source platform for data collection. And this was made in 2007, 2008, when Kenya was having its very first democratic elections. And essentially what was happening around the country was not a lot of good stuff, in the sense that people were being stopped from voting, some violence, lots of other things. And the founders of Ushahidi wanted to create a free and open tool for citizens to talk about what was happening in different locations. It's done through SMS, and lots of other data collection methods have been included in new versions. But essentially what it was it allowed anonymous submission of information from citizens about what was happening locally on the ground, and that helped the world know about what was happening there, and that was all done through open source tools. It's also been used since that time for crisis response. So the example is when the earthquake happened in Nepal, it was used to map what was happening in those spaces, like where the devastation had hit the most. And the Nepalese army used that information, that open source crowdsourced information, to deploy aid to those spaces. So that's Ushahidi, and that's where I worked as a designer for several years. And the other one, other tool on the screen at the moment is 10.4. Ushahidi doesn't really support this one anymore. But it was a aggregated crisis communication tool that was open source. So the idea, it was after a terrorist attack in Kenya. We created this tool because we had staff members in one of the malls and we couldn't get in contact with them. So we created this open source aggregation tool to send out multiple communication methods to find out whether everyone was okay. So that's what Ushahidi does. And in 2018 or 2019, which I'll go into in a little bit, we started to, well, Ushahidi's always had designers involved in the process, or at least more recently had designers involved in the process of their creation of their tools. But when I joined in 2018, after a little bit of getting settled within the open source space, I started to wonder, and I looked at all the contributions from developers coming in on the code base, and I was like, why aren't designers doing the same thing? I'm a designer, I'm in open source. Why aren't there the same thing happening for people like me, and why is that? So I asked this question. I asked my colleague as well. I worked with one other designer in Ushahidi at the time. And we sort of were really curious about this question. We started to ask our developers, we said, why doesn't this happen? Does this happen? And they were like, we're not quite sure. So we worked with a design agency called Designit, which is not open source, but they are very good. And in 2018 and 2019, we piloted with them some design jams or hackathons that were centered around the 10.4 communication tool, the open source communication tool, to really try and understand, would designers show up to a hackathon which is about contributing to an open source software tool? What could we learn about how to structure that kind of event for designers? Because typically you go along to a hackathon as a designer and you kind of stand around for a bit and go, I can do UI stuff maybe, icons, graphics, anyone? You maybe are useful, you're maybe not. But most of the time people don't quite know what to do with you at hackathons. Especially if you're in that place where you're entering very new and you need a friendly community of which to welcome you into what you can do. Because often you don't know the possibilities. You show up, you want to help, but you're not quite sure where you fit in best. So we piloted these events. They were hugely successful in the sense that people came and people did stuff and made contributions. Great, successful in actual issues and PRs as well. There is a video that I can share, and I'll share in the Discord so you can have a look at how that was supported. It was supported by Designit and Adobe at the time, and Ushahidi. And the biggest thing that we found out was most designers didn't quite, or a lot of designers don't quite know what open source is, but they understand what it means to contribute to something for good. And they want to contribute to things that do good. And there's a huge amount of designers that want to do this. They want to use their skills, contribute their skills, volunteer their skills towards something good. And that doesn't necessarily always have to mean non-profit good or like charity good, but sometimes the way that we would frame this in the events is that the critical infrastructure of open source upholds the internet, the open web, and therefore you're contributing to good because the open web is good. And once you explain it in that way, people get it, right? And designers are welcomed. So after this first series of events, these hackathons, we created the Open Design Project. We couldn't name it. It's hard to name branding. It's always hard. So we called it Open Design because it kind of says what we wanted to do. And the first part of Open Design was about trying to investigate more deeply the question about why aren't there more designers in open source and why doesn't this happen more? So we were successful in getting some funding from Adobe, which everyone can have opinions about if you want. Adobe I'll take their money, thank you very much, if it's going towards the designers in open source, and not use their proprietary tools. So anyway. But yeah, we did a lot of investigation in the first part to really understand what the challenges were and how we could frame this and carry this through and continue this kind of work. We did a whole heap of that, and you can find all of that research on the repository, the historic repository, which is on Ushahidi, which I've got a link for a little bit later. But essentially, what we wanted Open Design to do is, we framed it in this way, so designers collaborating and contributing to humanitarian open source software and tech for good at challenge gatherings. So we used different kinds of terminology in order to make it more accessible and friendly, so ways that designers could understand what they were contributing to. And let's go into some of the challenges. Now, I don't think I've got a great amount of time to go into depth in all of these challenges, but I'll do my best. So most designers, not all designers, some designers are actually coming from a tech background and kind of transition from coding into design. You actually find a lot of the open source design .NET designers have come from a coding background and transitioned into design roles. But most designers really don't have a clue about what open source software is or can be. And that's the critical part, is the can be. So when speaking to designers and other roles, so not just designers, we had a lot of product managers, a lot of writers, a lot of creatives generally, coming along to these events that we wanted to create because they felt like it was a place for them. They felt like they could come along and that there was something that they could do there that isn't the typical kind of hackathon-like description. And they were really surprised about the diversity of projects. So we didn't just talk about the Ushahidi projects, which are reasonably understandable within the context of contributing to something for good. It's very obviously an NGO, very obviously humanitarian purpose. But when we had them there, we talked about all the different kind of infrastructure that Ushahidi was built on, the coding languages that it was built on, and the nature of open source and the different things that they could then contribute to. We then talked about all the different things that they might have touched as designers, all the different tools, services, the web that they never knew was open source. And we sort of began to open them to this world. And they were very, very grateful. And it's much more accessible once you frame it in this way. The second challenge, I'm just going to get some water, is that open source software isn't part of design education. So something that really surprised me when I was in industry, like when I was working in proprietary or just regular software companies, was how much open source software is kind of pervasive within the education system of becoming a coder, or a developer or someone working with code, whether or not you go traditional, I guess, like university, or whether you self-teach. Open source is something that you will use, learn about, touch in some way. Whereas in design education, it's largely completely absent, and even if you are using open tools, they aren't explained as open tools and open source. The nature of them isn't explained within design education, even if you're using the technologies, which is part of the problem. So designers just don't get taught these kinds of things unless they seek it out, or unless a friendly person helps them seek it out and teaches them. This is changing though. A couple of years ago, Darmstadt University in Germany have a whole module in one of their design courses, which is all about using open source tech for designers. So things are changing, which is super cool. Oh, connected to this, which is, I can't go into much depth about this, is one of the things that is great for developers with open source is that it can become part of your CV. It becomes part of how you show your skills. And because designers aren't taught about in education, and it's not valued as part of their development process, if you're then going into job interviews and saying, hey, look at all these open source design interviews, look at all these open source projects I'm contributing to, the design managers are like, what? So the whole system of how open source needs to go into the design space really does need to be cyclical, because if we're teaching it, it then also needs to be taught to the organizations that then value it as something that is hireable. So anyway. Okay. So even if they know about open source software, or they've learned about it from these events, GitHub, absolutely a barrier. GitHub, GitLab, terminal, all these things, creating and deploying the local instance of a software on, an open source software on your machine, absolutely a barrier. Loads of designers want to contribute, but they can't because they actually have to, do a Docker instance of this to actually see what it does if it's got a GUI, which often they don't. But you're not exempt from design because we've done design support for pip and terminal things, so don't think that you're exempt from needing design help if you just do terminal work. But yeah, it's absolutely a barrier. So they don't know what the interface does, they don't know the terminology, and they need friendly people to come and help where they can fit in. There's also a lot of infrastructure on GitHub and GitLab that doesn't yet support the kinds of workflows that designers have. So, you can drop a static image or even a video link into a lot of issue comments, and like prototype links, but a lot of this isn't really supported within these systems, and therefore it's not valued. Yeah. Okay, so this one. take a moment to read it. Most open source projects that we talk to and that I've experienced and contributed to tens of open source projects myself and mentored many, many designers contributing to other open source projects, they understand design as logos and graphics or GUI, and it's not always that. So just like Tarek was saying, it's not just about the UI, it's not just about the visual things that designers can help with and designers add value to. It's about really understanding what you're trying to do, who you're trying to serve, and whether or not you actually know who you're trying to serve. Because as soon as your open source project has one more user, one more clone, one more fork, it's not just for you. You're not just building a software for you. You're building it for you and one other person, and then another set of people, and then another set of people. And you will absolutely not know exactly what all those people need until you do user research, which designers can help with, and we're very happy to. Oh, this one. So one of the big things that I needed to do in the second round of workshops, which I'll talk a little bit about, is project issues. I know that there's a lot of advice out there on how to write really good issues, and I'm not suggesting that any of you in this room write bad issues, though maybe you do. But maybe you don't write accessible issues, so maybe you don't write issues that everybody can understand and everybody can contribute to. And the project issues within even our repositories at Ushahidi, when we were wanting designers to contribute, were really restrictive. So they were really focused in on the technology side of things, not about like how to actually solve a problem, essentially. And often when designers began to understand what the issues were trying to describe that they wanted, they often said, well, have you thought about this? Oh, that's another issue. Have you thought about this? There's another issue to create. So one of the things that designers were doing with these issues was kind of breaking out of the restrictive nature and kind of really helping to understand the wider problem that a particular issue might be addressing. So they were asking questions kind of like, oh, what was this one? So an example might be design a form capture for new volunteers that includes name, email, and address. So this was a real issue in 10.4, our open source tool. And what that issue is doing is largely dictating what they think they want. They want form capture for this, this, and this. And it leaves very little room for exploration for what actually the users want to do and need to do and why. So the kinds of questions that designers were asking were, why is this form needed? What's it trying to do? Why those data points specifically? How should this be stored? Where should this be stored? Why should this be stored? What are you going to do with it? So it's all those kinds of questions about the contextual information around the issue. So designers in particular do need this context in order to better understand what the problem is going to be. And you might think that there are issues that don't ever need any design help, but if you introduce them to a designer, I'm sure that they'll have some questions about the issue. But the alternative to that is that when we did the first set of workshops, we went in with very broad challenges. And those, from the design perspective, really lacked focus and relevancy. So when you offer, like, say to a designer in this hackathon workshop situation, you say, well, we have a tool that does this, and we'd like to explore how to make improvements over here, then designers tend to create design work and questions that are not necessarily grounded in the reality of like the current technology functions, or maybe the restrictions that are to do with the technology, or maybe even within the scope. So that they'll start to create things which we call in the design space design fiction, or vaporware, really, in a lot of ways. So they'll start to design things which are technically unfeasible. So like voice-activated things when you haven't got the capability to have voice input for certain tools and things like that. So you really need to strike a balance between very restrictive issues and very open explorative issues. So, what did we do? Once we did all this information gathering, all of these different challenges, and there are more challenges in the research I didn't go into, we wanted to trial our new framework for different design workshops and interventions. And we took all of this different framework, which is on the open repository, and we took them to 2 different places. We took them to Bangalore in India and Taipei in Taiwan, to 2 conferences that were, one was a design conference specifically, and the other was an open source conference with the design aspect, to see which one, whether, designers came to a design conference more, or whether they came to an open source conference more. They equally came to both, turns out. If you invite them within the spaces where they're welcomed, they come. And the reason that we chose these 2 spaces is contextual to the open source tool that we were doing the hackathon for, so the 10-4 crisis communication tool. So this is one of the other things that's really important, which could be easily missed in this, which is when you're speaking to designers or wanting designers to contribute to your tool, making sure that they are within the context, or that the context is close by, is really, really useful. So we made sure that we wanted to go to places that have experienced crises, disasters, and Bangalore had just had a series of devastating floods in the southwest, or nearby Bangalore in Kerala. And Taiwan had had some terrible typhoons. So what we were able to do was make it grounded in the reality of what had been happening there. So when you're thinking about your open source software projects, think about where the physical environmental realities are happening, like where, if it's something to do with schools, makes sense to do it in schools. So think about the context, think about the space. I got some lovely photos of designers doing design things at these hackathons. Lots of post-its. Don't skimp on the post-its if you're engaging with designers about open source. And we structured these workshops, and you can find all of this on the repository. But we structured these workshops around different design activities, because the audience was primarily designers, although we did get a few developers come into the design activities and hackathons, which was really, really fun. But we structured them around 5 different activities. The first was empathy mapping, which is really understanding your users. Second was defining the problems. So this was taking one of the issues that we had converted into design language, and they were defining the problem. We did an ideation exercise. We did storyboarding for the ideation that the teams had chose, and then we did sketching and prototyping, all within the kind of, I think we did full day workshops. So this is in sort of 8 hours-ish. And a lot of these activities inbuilt in these was a lot of team cohesion, because we recognized, being in open source for as long as we had, that part of open source and making open source successful is feeling part of a team, whether that's a team across borders digitally through your computer screen, or a team that you're sat at a table. The idea of community cohesion helps contribution. So a lot of these activities were there to help the groups really solidify and get cohesive with their contributions. And they created a lot of prototypes, which they submitted in issues to the specific issues that they were responding to. So they were encouraged to produce these prototypes. And then these were the first iteration of prototypes, and the idea was that we'd have second rounds and further rounds of prototypes to refine the purpose of them. They also had feedback sessions with users, which I'll go on to in a moment, for these prototypes. And the intention was to take them through a series of user testing with our actual users to make sure that they were indeed solving the problem that they were intending to solve. So I want to talk a little bit about the things that we discovered are really important after these 2 other workshops that we did. So I mentioned earlier that there's a balance to creating those issues and creating design challenges. And I did a lot of work in translating issues into design challenges and making sure that there was that bridge of communication that worked really, really well between the 2 different functions. And there's an example, which again I can pop in the Discord. And yeah, the main thing with these translation from issues into design challenges was not trying to offer the solution and not thinking that you have all the answers and that, oh, it just needs to do this and look like this and function like this. It was about, we think that it could function like this, but what it really needs to do is achieve this, this, and this, because there might be alternatives around designing a different solution that maybe you hadn't thought about. Describing the problem is really important within these design challenges. It also helps them to develop an understanding about what you want to do with the tool overall, or what you want to do with your software overall. Cool. The other one, which I've touched on already, is being location specific. So because open source is relatively new to designers as well, our processes and communities really aren't structured or socialized very well, and not the same as developer communities really at the moment. So as well as the location being specific and important to the purpose of the tool, it was also really important for it to be location specific and good for that kind of sense of community, so that designers didn't think that they were one designer trying to do it all by themselves, that they had a community around them and they had the support. Often designers that don't contribute in a group scenario are like solo designers trying to go into a project absolutely by themselves and kind of really have a rough time, and then bounce out and typically come back to the open source design.net community and kind of say, I tried to contribute this design, but I got, chewed up and spat out, so what do I do now? And then they come back to the community and we say, well, maybe try this way, or maybe try explaining it this way. So we wanted to build that kind of sense of community within this location and making sure that they had a support network. Cool. And then the last one, which is really important, especially for the kind of tools that we were creating, the humanitarian and human rights tool, making sure that you invite users, humans. We called them witnesses because of their relevancy to crisis. So we didn't want to kind of other them by calling them a user. Sorry, I can't turn off my Discord noise. So we called them witnesses and we gave them a brief. So we invited them explicitly, paid them for their time as well, since they had been experienced crisis in this scenario and often lost a lot of income or other things. And what they were there to do was give that extra context about what their perspective was about using the open source or being a part of that open source. So in these contexts, they were the kinds of people sending in crisis communications using the tool, not a tool modifying or contributing to the tool, but they were using it in certain ways and needing to deploy it. So it was super critical within this context to make sure that they were well heard. They also did feedback rounds. So after the prototypes were created, we invited them back to tell the design teams, hey, yeah, we think that this works in this way, but have you considered this? So it was really critical and so good for both the designers and the open source project to really have the people that were contextually using things part of the process. And you can do this digitally. This doesn't have to be in person. Like, this can totally be facilitated just in your sort of online repository space as well. So I've gone over time. But the ideas of open design and open source design are essentially to increase and sustain contribution, to support the design community, to build understanding between design and open source software, which is really critical. We don't often understand each other and we don't speak each other's language very well. So we do really need to make an effort to understand each other. And bringing open design to education and workplaces so that we can have it valued at all those different stages. But that was all stuff that was in 2018 and 2019. So what's happened since then? There's been a few years. I mean, there's been pandemics, but anyway. Lots of stuff has happened. So I did a workshop with developers and maintainers at Open Source 101. I did a full-day workshop about how to welcome and invite designers into the process. So how to write a contributing design.md for your repository, how to make good first issues for designers explicitly, how to make sure that there is that space for them. I did a workshop with designers at UX Bristol. What is open source? How can you search on GitHub for a project that you want to find and contribute to? How do you become welcome in this space? How do you speak the language? Kind of trying to do that process of condensing the manual into a workshop for designers. So it's delivered by somebody that they kind of have a connection to. I speak their language. I did a workshop with human rights activists, technologists at RightsCon. Loads of talks about this, similar to this one. Lots of mentoring of designers and developing internship schemes with open source design, talking to Outreachy and Google Summer of Code about what it's like to introduce designers into those kinds of schemes, because you can do it, and it does work. Maintaining the open source design community, it's a labor of love. Fundraising, we got our first grant approved from the Vermont Complex Systems Centre for capturing designers' stories of how they contribute to open source. Designers don't really document and talk about how they do this process, and we need more of that. And it needs to be funded. And yeah, doing my PhD, which is hard. So, it's all there as a methodology to use. It's all the different documents are there, all the structures are there. If you want to run a design workshop for your open source tools or your projects, take a look there. There's the historic repo, which is still on the Ushahidi organization, or is the one that I'm maintaining at the moment on my own personal GitHub. There's opensourcedesign.net. We're lovely, friendly. We'll talk about design with you, and open source. We're talking at the moment about spending our Open Collective money on internship. Yeah, internship and fellowship schemes where we pair a designer with a developer to go into an internship, so that it's not just a designer going in solo, not just a developer going in solo, but there's a pair, there's a unit there. We think that's going to be really exciting. And Sustain podcast has a series of other podcasts. So there's the main podcast, but there's also one where we just talk to designers about open source. There's 25 episodes, so there's a lot to talk about with just design and open source. But there's also a docs podcast. There's an OSPO, if you're interested in OSPOs. Loads of podcasts. And that's me done. I've gone way over time, but thank you.
That was brilliant, thank you. Any questions from anyone? Something went bub. It could have been a question. Yeah, at the back there.
It seems to me that open source is something that software developers know how to do, rather than designers don't know how to do. Are there any other communities that you think would be really able to contribute to data?
Product managers? So there's been a couple of There's a couple of, there was like a few talks from product managers within open source. There's a couple of podcast episodes in the open source design, the Sustaining Open Source Design podcast about product management. But yeah, there's no community at the moment for product managers that want to get involved in open source software. And that's a really tricky thing, right? Like, how do you jump into an open source project and start, doing product management, like helping build a roadmap? Is really, really tricky because you need a time, essentially, to do that. So that's a community that has not really been utilized much. And then I would say there's lots, but so I mentor a designer that's contributing to a open source music software. And this is kind of connected to what I would suggest anyway, but it baffles me that there's no musicians actively contributing about how they use that tool. And the designers involved in that project have really been trying to bring in those users, those humans, into like, well, actually these choirs are using this music tool, so can we listen to them? Can we receive their contributions? And I do think the other community is the people that use it that don't modify it in any way. So we often think that open source software, if we use it, we also modify it, but that's not always the case. There's lots of people that use it and don't modify it and never will, and we need to hear from them and how to make it better. Is that okay?
I think I'd throw some others into the mix. Writers, whether creative writers or technical writers, you just don't see them in open source. I think one of the things that I found really memorable in your talk actually was right back at the beginning, and that's not to say I fell asleep through the rest of it. It's just that you said something really early on that struck a chord. It was about motivation. And I think for developers and engineers, one of our main motivations is just scratching the itch. I know Alex's talk, that was about scratching a personal itch. That's why we do it. But you mentioned designers. A lot of their motivation was to do good. And so my question for you is, do designers ever just scratch that itch? Do designers go home and just design stuff for the fun of designing stuff?
They do. They often do it through the method of portfolio pieces. Okay, so designers are notorious for, and I have a lot of problems with this. I'm not well liked by either of the communities in some ways, open source or designers, because I sit in the middle. But designers will go and redesign Spotify or design Facebook for their portfolio. And what I say to them is, why don't you contribute to an open source project and have a real project to put in your portfolio? And then you get the experience of, working with a team as well. So yeah, they do it. And I also think that there are open source projects that, so the font foundries, so designers doing and font creators making fonts. That's a really good example of scratching your own itch. I love Comic Sans. It's very accessible for people with dyslexia, so it's a good font. But yeah, there are definitely designers out there creating UI kits. A lot of the designers doing that kind of scratch your own itch are not really necessarily always doing it on places like GitHub, but they're being facilitated through things like Figma now. So Figma, even though it's not open source, has a really big open design community, and the difference between open design and open source design is that it's opening up design as opposed to design for open source, in a sense, or open sourcing your design. And so there's tons of communities using Figma to say, oh, I created this UI system, here's the Figma file, use it. Whereas kind of what I often say to them is, you could go a little bit more and kind of open source that in a different way, but they aren't quite there yet, even though Penpot exists and everyone should be using Penpot, which is a great open source design tool. But yeah, we do, but it's hard to find if you don't know where to look.